They called it the Jug. When it first appeared over the airfields of England, the German pilots laughed. From the cockpits of their sleek Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, they saw a lumbering brute, thick-bodied, heavy, and utterly inept. It looked more like a flying beer barrel than a fighter. They joked that if you shot at it, it would drop bombs of fuel just to drown you. They laughed, until the laughter died in the sound of thunder, because what they were seeing was not a mistake of design. It was not a failed experiment. It was the P-47 Thunderbolt, a machine that would rewrite the laws of survival in air combat, built around one of the most powerful engines ever put into an aircraft. The Pratt & Whitney R2, ATO or double wasp. The Thunderbolt was less a plane, and more a flying fortress for one man. Its wings carried 8 .50 caliber Browning machine guns, 8 streams of destruction that could shred metal, armor, and bone. It was the largest, heaviest single-engine fighter of the Second World War, and it was about to make the Luftwaffe pay for every bomb dropped, every city burned, every life lost. The irony was cruel and perfect. The Germans had mocked its size, yet that very mass was what made it nearly indestructible. The Jug could come home with its tail shot away, wings full of holes, and the pilot still alive. When it first flew in 1941, few believed it could work. But by 1944, it was one of the deadliest fighters in the sky. The laughter had turned to silence and fear. This is the story of the beast that became the guardian of Europe, of how American steel, stubborn engineering, and sheer will turned ridicule into retribution. This is German pilots laughed at the P-47 Thunderbolt until its 8.50s rained lead on them. The year was 1940. The world was burning. In the laboratories and factories of the United States, engineers were racing against time. Across the Atlantic, Hitler's Luftwaffe was tearing the skies apart. Poland, France, the Low Countries, all had fallen under the shadow of the Black Cross. Britain stood alone, and the RAF was bleeding to keep the German bombers at bay. America, not yet at war, watched and learned. If the conflict came, it would demand machines beyond anything ever built, faster, tougher, deadlier. At Republic Aviation in Farmingdale, New York, a small team of designers led by Alexander Kartveli began sketching a fighter unlike any other. Kartveli, a Georgian-born engineer who had fled the chaos of Europe, believed that survival in the skies would depend not on grace, but on power. He envisioned a new kind of warplane, one that could climb higher, fly faster, and take more punishment than anything before it, where others dreamed of lightness and agility. He dreamed of strength. The early prototypes were monstrous. The fuselage was bulky, the cockpit perched high, and the air intake sat like a giant grin beneath the nose. Even within Republic, pilots joked that it looked like a flying milk jug. But inside that ugly frame was genius. At its heart roared the Pratt & Whitney R280, a radial engine of unmatched force, 18 cylinders, 2,000 horsepower, and a sound that shook hangars. To feed it, Kartveli designed a turbo-supercharger system that required massive ducting through the fuselage. That's why the plane was so large. It wasn't built for elegance. It was built for endurance. In late 1941, the prototype XP-47B took to the air. Onlookers at Republic's airfield held their breath as the ungainly machine rumbled down the runway. The roar was deafening, and when it lifted into the sky, its size seemed to defy the laws of aerodynamics. Then came the speed over 400 miles per hour, a record for a piston-engine fighter of its class. Kartveli had done it, but victory came with questions. The plane's takeoff distance was long. Its climb rate was sluggish, and it consumed fuel like a hungry dragon. Pilots cajade it a flying gas tank. The skeptics within the U.S. Army Air Forces worried. How could this beast ever compete in combat? Still, with war approaching fast, the military took a gamble. Production was ordered. Republic P-47B Thunderbolt, the new heavy fighter of the U.S. Army Air Forces. Factories roared to life. In Farmingdale and Evansville, thousands of workers, men and women, began building the Jug. They riveted aluminum, wired the electrical systems, and painted the giant star insignias on the wings. Each one carried a silent pride. They weren't just building a plane. They were building America's promise to fight back. Then came Pearl Harbor. December 7th, 1941. The day the world changed. America was at war, and suddenly, the need for the Thunderbolt wasn't theoretical anymore, it was survival. By mid-1942, the first P-47 squadrons began to train. Pilots transitioning from lighter aircraft like the P-40 or Spitfire were stunned. The Jug felt like a tank with wings, heavy on the stick, ponderous in turns, and sluggish in climb. Many dismissed it. Some even feared it. But those who learned its secrets, who understood its speed, dive, and sheer durability, discovered something extraordinary. The P-47 could dive faster than any aircraft on Earth. It could take hits that would destroy any other plane, and when its 50 caliber Brownings opened fire, the sky lit up like lightning. No other fighter could carry that much firepower with that much ammunition. The Jug didn't just fight, it annihilated. By the spring of 1943, the first P-47 units arrived in England. The 56th Fighter Group, known as Zemke's Wolfpack, under the command of Hubert Zim, would be the first to test the beast against the Luftwaffe. The stage was set. The Germans still ruled the air. The Americans were coming, and the world was about to witness a transformation from mockery to menace. The spring skies over England in 1943 were filled with the rumble of engines. The war had entered its third brutal year, and the airfields of East Anglia and the Midlands were alive with activity. Hundreds of aircraft, painted in olive drab and invasion stripes, stood like metal beasts waiting for release. Among them, new arrivals gleamed in the cold morning mist, Republic P-47 Thunderbolts. To most of the young pilots seeing them for the first time, the reaction was the same. Disbelief. They were enormous, nearly the size of a medium bomber. Compared to the sleek Spitfire or the agile P-51 Mustang that would come later, the Thunderbolt looked ungainly, almost comical. Pilots joked that it was a 7-ton milk jug that somehow learned to fly. Even within the American ranks, there was skepticism. The men of the 56th Fighter Group, who had trained for months in lighter aircraft, now stood before machines that looked like they belonged in a factory rather than the sky. But war does not wait for comfort. The Luftwaffe was still the master of the European skies. The Messerschmitt, Bf-109, and the Focke-Wulf FW-190 were legends, fast, nimble, deadly. Their pilots were veterans, many of them with hundreds of kills. Against such opponents, the Americans were still finding their footing. And now, into this crucible came the P-47. The first missions were escort operations, protecting B-17 flying fortresses on their bombing runs deep into occupied France. It was dangerous work. The bombers, massive and slow, were sitting targets for German fighters. The Thunderbolts were their shield, but in those early months, the shield was still untested. The pilots soon discovered the Thunderbolt's limits. Its heavy frame meant it climbed like a reluctant bird. The turbo supercharger made it powerful, but only at high altitude. At Les Belles, the engine lagged, and its fuel consumption was staggering. More than one pilot found himself watching his gauges in panic as the needle dipped far too quickly. German radio chatter often carried taunts. Luftwaffe pilots calling the Thunderbolt der Fliegende Charge, the flying coffin. They laughed as the big American machines struggled to keep up. But laughter has a way of dying in combat, because what the Germans hadn't yet learned was what happened when a Thunderbolt dove. On April 15, 1943, over the skies of northern France, the 56th Fighter Group made contact. A formation of FW-190s appeared out of the sun, swooping down on the bombers like hawks. The P-47s turned to meet them. What followed was chaos. Twisting contrails, tracers slicing the clouds, engines howling in agony. The German fighters, sleek and maneuverable, darted and rolled with ease. The Americans tried to follow, but the Thunderbolt couldn't turn with them. Then one pilot, out of instinct and desperation, shoved his throttle forward and pointed his nose downward. The heavy aircraft fell like a stone past 450 miles per hour, then 480, then 500. The air screamed around the fuselage. The altimeter spun. The controls stiffened, but the plane held together. The German behind him tried to follow. His Focke-Wulf began to shake, then disintegrated in mid. That day, the P-47 pilots discovered their hidden weapon. The dive, a high-speed no fighter in the world could catch a Thunderbolt. Its mass, its strength, its sheer power, all came alive in that vertical plunge. It could dive, strike, and climb again before the enemy even understood what had happened. From that moment on, the laughter began to fade. The P-47's armament was unmatched. 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, each capable of firing nearly 800 rounds per minute, created a storm of lead so thick that a single burst could rip a bomber apart. Pilots described it as riding the sound of thunder. When those guns opened up, the whole aircraft shook. The tracers streaked through the sky like molten metal. German fighters caught in the barrage simply vanished, shredded, burning, falling in pieces. Even the ground crews at the airfields learned to recognize the sound, a distinct, rhythmic growl that echoed across the countryside when a Thunderbolt returned from battle, guns empty, smoke trailing from its barrels. Still, the P-47 remained a paradox. It was heavy and fast, yet surprisingly forgiving. It could absorb punishment that would destroy other fighters. There were countless stories of pilots returning home with holes in their wings the size of fists, engines smoking, controls half destroyed. Yet the Jug kept flying. One pilot landed with half his tail shot away. Another made it back with a cylinder head blown off and oil spraying across his canopy. In one legendary case, a Thunderbolt returned from France with an entire section of its fuselage missing. The pilot barely alive, but alive nonetheless. Mechanics would gather around the returning aircraft, staring in disbelief. Then they would patch it up, refuel it, and send it back out the next morning. The Germans began to notice. By late 1943, Luftwaffe pilots no longer mocked the Jug. They respected it and feared it. They learned to avoid its dives and its head-on attacks. They realized that trying to shoot one down was like trying to kill a tank with a knife. The men who flew the P-47 became legends. Francis Gabi Gabreski, Robert San Johnson, and Uwe Zemseg. Names that would echo through the history of air combat. Gabreski was relentless, hunting German aircraft even after his guns ran dry, sometimes ramming enemies with his wingtips. Johnson once flew home after being hit by more than 20 shells, his plane so torn apart that his commander refused to believe it could have flown at all. And Zemk.com/Tactica. Brilliant developed the strategies that made the Thunderbolt unstoppable. He taught his pilots to use their speed and dive to their advantage, to strike from above, to control the fight rather than chase it. The 56th Fighter Group became known as the Wolf Pack, and the skies over France and Germany began to belong to them. By the end of 1943, the results were undeniable. The Thunderbolt had claimed hundreds of kills. The Luftwaffe was bleeding. And with each mission, the Jug evolved. New models, the P-47D, and later the P-47MA, improved its performance, extended its range, and refined its power. Soon, Thunderbolts were escorting bombers all the way to the heart of Germany, to Hamburg, to Bremen, to Berlin. The laughter that once echoed in the German radio waves was gone. In its place was static, silence, and the sound of engines falling from the sky. The war in the air was shifting. The beast had found its rhythm. The Ruhr Valley lay beneath a blanket of smoke, fire, and twisting columns of industrial region Germany once called its beating industrial heart. By 1944, it had become something else entirely. A battlefield without borders, where the ground war fused with the air war in a roaring, metallic orchestra. And the P-47 Thunderbolt, once mocked, now descended into this furnace like a steel predator built for chaos. The Luftwaffe's grip over the Ruhr had evaporated. What remained was a concentration of flak towers, armored trains, machine gun nests, and columns of vehicles crawling through narrow valleys. German rail networks once precise, efficient arteries of war had become the prime target of a new Allied strategy. Paralysis through total destruction. The Thunderbolt was uniquely suited for this mission. The aircraft that German pilots had laughed at for being overweight now turned its mass into a weapon. It dove like a falling anvil, accelerating with terrifying speed. Its thick armor shrugged off, hits that would have shredded lighter fighters. Its radial engine refused to die, even when pierced. And its 8.50 caliber machine guns unleashed a storm of fire that tore steel, armor, and flesh with equal brutality. Flights of P-47s swept across the valleys, flying dangerously low, sometimes so low that treetops thrashed violently in their wake. Each dive carried the weight of a thunderclap. Trains erupted into plumes of sparks and steam. Locomotive boilers ruptured in explosions that sent shrapnel spiraling hundreds of feet. Entire convoys vanished in trails of smoke, their twisted debris scattering across fields and roads. German soldiers soon learned to fear the distant rumble of Pratt and Whitney engines. The sound carried a grim certainty. If they heard the roar, they knew death wasn't far behind. Survivors described the attacks as sudden, merciless storms that arrived without warning, lightning made of metal, thunder made of fire. The Ruhr defenses responded with ferocity, the sky filled with black bursts of flak, each explosion carving wounds into the air. The Thunderbolts flew straight through it, enduring hits that should have crippled them. Pilots returned to base with holes in their wings, ruptured panels, missing control surfaces, yet the aircraft kept flying. What began as disbelief soon turned into reverence. The Jug's resilience wasn't just a reputation. It was a truth earned in burning skies. Each mission grew more daring. P-47 formations, dove at angles, no handbook recommended, pushing the aircraft to the limit of structural endurance. The roar of their guns drowned out even the explosions below. In the span of months, the Ruhr's rail network crumbled. Factories slowed, then halted. German commanders, once confident, now watched helplessly as the Thunderbolt's reign of destruction tightened around them. This was not elegant air combat. It was raw, brutal, and relentless. It was war stripped to its most primal form, steel against steel, fire against fire. And in that furnace, the P-47 transformed from a misunderstood machine into a symbol of unstoppable Allied force. The pilots who flew it felt the shift. They were no longer merely fighter escorts. They were executioners of industrial warfare, swinging a hammer so heavy that every blow reshaped the strategic map of Europe. By the end of the Ruhr campaign, the mocking laughter of German pilots had gone silent. In its place came a quiet, grim acknowledgments, spoken only in their operations rooms and after-action reports. The Thunderbolt had become the most dangerous low-level attacker in the skies of Europe, and it was only growing deadlier. The war was accelerating. The front lines were shifting, and the P-47 was about to unleash a final, overwhelming display of power that would define its legacy forever. By mid-1944, Europe trembled under the weight of a machine the Allies had perfected. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once doubted, had now risen to dominate every corner of the air war, from the coastlines of France to the plains of Poland. Its thunderous roar became the soundtrack of the collapsing Third Reich. The Luftwaffe, once proud and feared, had been bled nearly dry. Experienced aces were gone. Fuel was scarce. Maintenance crews worked with dwindling parts and shattered morale. And above them, the Thunderbolts filled the sky in numbers that seemed endless. The transformation had been staggering. The Jug, initially dismissed by Allied and Axis pilots alike, now executed multi-role missions with a confidence that bordered on ruthlessness. High-altitude escort, low-level strafing, dive bombing, rocket attacks, armored convoy destruction. The P-47 excelled at all of them. It had become the ultimate hybrid, a fighter with the heart of a bomber and the soul of a predator. Every day, waves of Thunderbolts carved paths through enemy territory. Their shadows passed over towns, rail lines, and bunkers. They dismantled what remained of Germany's logistical systems with methodical precision. Where they flew, the war moved faster. What had begun as mere tactical support evolved into strategic dominance. German movement by day became nearly impossible. Trains were destroyed before they reached their destinations. Tanks were reduced to burning hulks on roadsides. Troops scattered for cover the moment the distant rumble reached their ears. The Thunderbolt pilots, once rookies, still learning to manage the aircraft size and weight, had grown into war-hardened experts. Each mission honed their instincts. Each engagement deepened their understanding of the Jug's brutal advantages. They flew with confidence, bordering on defiance. The skies belonged to them now. The Germans, desperate and outmatched, attempted to adapt. They scrambled Me-109s and FW-190s whenever fuel allowed, hoping to challenge the intruders. But by now, the Thunderbolts fought with a momentum impossible to stop. Altitude, speed, firepower, and numbers all tilted against the Luftwaffe. Dogfights no longer favored the once nimble German fighters. The Jug dove faster, shot harder, and endured damage that would rip its opponents apart. German pilots who once scoffed at its bulky frame now saw it for what it truly was. A flying fortress disguised as a fighter. And still, the Thunderbolt evolved. New fuel tanks extended its range. New tactics increased its lethality. New formations multiplied its impact. By late 1944, it had become one of the primary instruments of air supremacy, supporting the Allied advance from Normandy through the Ardennes and deep into Germany. It was there in the final months of the war that the P-47 reached the height of its legend. Columns of Thunderbolts swept across German cities, forests, and fortifications with devastating sinks. They struck military targets with overwhelming force. They destroyed infrastructure with surgical precision. They broke counterattacks before they could form, and they carried the roar of inevitable defeat to every corner of the Reich. The Luftwaffe's last combat reports told the story plainly. The fear was not hidden. It had become clinical, measurable. German pilots warned each other to avoid Thunderbolts whenever possible. Ground commanders marked P-47 zones with caution. Anti-aircraft batteries shifted priority to the hulking fighters that had become synonymous with destruction. The aircraft the Germans had once joked about had reshaped the battlefield. By 1945, the Thunderbolt was no longer merely a machine. It had become a force of nature, a storm of steel, a thunderclap that echoed across Europe. And even as the war's end approached, the legacy of the P-47 only grew stronger, its contributions evident in every retreating German column, every shattered supply line, every liberated town. What began in ridicule ended in reverence. From the ashes of Europe rose a truth impossible to deny. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once mocked as a lumbering jug, had become one of the most fearsome aircraft ever to dominate the skies. The war in Europe staggered into its final months like a wounded giant. Cities lay in ruins. Roads flowed with refugees. The skies, once arenas of duels and daring became corridors of Allied dominance. And among the countless machines that had shaped the conflict, one cast a shadow larger than any pilot had imagined the day it first left the runway. The P-47 Thunderbolt, born of skepticism and burdened with ridicule, had become an icon carved from noise and fire. Its story did not end with the fall of Berlin. Rather, its legend began there. Long before victory parades and fading headlines, Thunderbolts lined up on captured German airfields, their fuselages scarred with bullet holes, their paint chipped by flak, their engines still carrying the heat of countless missions. Ground crews who had worked through ice, mud, and night stood beside them, knowing they had helped build something immortal. Pilots walked their final pre-flight inspections, running gloved hands across wings that had carried them through storms of steel. Some aircraft bore the marks of impossible survival panels, torn open by cannon fire, fuel tanks punctured and hastily patched, engines scorched black from overheating. Yet they always flew, in briefing rooms. Commanders spoke quietly about what the Jug had accomplished, how it had escorted bombers deep into the heart of Germany when fuel and distance made other fighters stumble, how it had shattered rail networks and armored columns, how it had become the spearhead of ground attack strategy, how it had broken the Luftwaffe's will long before its last aircraft fell from the sky. Numbers told a story even the most hardened skeptics couldn't deny. Thousands of trains destroyed, thousands of vehicles rendered scrap, countless missions completed, countless air battles. But the legacy of the Thunderbolt was not bound to statistics. It lived instead in the memories of those who witnessed it. 2 German soldiers. It was a nightmare that arrived with the roar of doom. 2 Allied troops advancing on the ground. It was salvation, an angel of thunder that swept the battlefield clean ahead of them. 2 its pilots. It was more than an aircraft. It was a companion that never gave up, never faltered, never abandoned them in the sky. Years passed, and the world changed. The age of jets dawned. Air forces retired their prop-driven war, replacing them with sleek new machines built for a different kind of war. Many aircraft faded into obscurity, but not the P-47. Its hulking shape found its way into museums, air shows, memorials, and documentaries. Veterans spoke of it with gratitude that bordered on reverence. Historians wrote about it as the unsung workhorse that helped win the war. Aviation enthusiasts around the world placed it in a rare category of machines that were not just built, but born. The laughter that once echoed from German cockpits was long forgotten. The judgment of history was clear. The P-47 Thunderbolt was one of the greatest fighting aircraft ever created. Yet for all the destruction it delivered, its true meaning lay in something greater. It represented perseverance. It symbolized how strength can be misunderstood, how innovation can be mocked before it is praised, how a machine can rise above expectations and change the course of history. It stood as a testament to the men who built it, the engineers who dreamed beyond convention, the mechanics who kept it alive, and the pilots who rode its thunder into battle. Their courage, sweat, and sacrifice were woven into the frame of every jug that took to the sky, and so its legend endures. Every time its engine roars at an air show, spectators feel a vibration older than themselves, a resonance from a time when nations fought for survival, when courage was measured in minutes of combat, when the skies over Europe trembled beneath wings of metal. The Thunderbolt's echo reaches across generations. It is the echo of a war fought in smoke and steel. It is the echo of men who flew into danger without hesitation. It is the echo of a machine that refused to die. A machine that outlasted mockery. A machine that shattered doubt. A machine that earned its name. In the end, the P-47 was never merely an aircraft. It was thunder given form. And the sky was its battlefield.